Lord, be like thee, blessed Redeemer. This is my constant longing and prayer. Gladly I'll forfeit all of earth's treasures, Jesus, thy perfect likeness to wear. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, full of compassion, loving, forgiving, tender and kind, helping the helpless, cheering the fainting, seeking the wandering sinner to find. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, lowly in spirit, holy and harmless, patient and brave, meekly enduring cruel reproaches, willing to suffer, others to save. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, Lord, I am coming now to receive the anointing divine. All that I am and have I am bringing, Lord, from this moment all shall be thine. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. To be like Jesus, to be like Jesus, all I ask, to be like him, all through life's journey, from earth to glory, all I ask, to be like him. To be like Jesus, to be like Jesus, how I long to be like him, so meek and holy, so pure and holy, how I long to be like him.
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful to Thee for this beautiful day, for the many blessings of it. Father, we're thankful to Thee for our health, which allows us to be here tonight. Thank Thee for this another opportunity to come together to worship Thee in the middle of the week as we close out our gospel meeting tonight. Thank Thee, Father, for this opportunity. Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for all the blessings in life that You provide us with, for many things that we take for granted that we can't. So many things You provide us, Father, we can't even count. For food or shelter or clothing. Above all these things, Father, we thank Thee for hope and salvation that comes from Jesus Christ, Thy Son. Father, it's our prayer pray tonight that you'll be with us, help us to learn how to be more like Jesus, to follow his footsteps, so that at the end of life's way we can have hope and eternal life with you, just like so. Father, we are thankful for this gospel meeting we had this week, and pray, Father, that you again be with us tonight, and with Brother May and Isaac brings the lesson. We just pray that you help us to focus intently on thy word to gain much good from the lesson. Father, we thank thee for the congregation of thy people that is here. We thank you for the good elders that we have, and we pray, Father, special blessing on them as they lead us, that you would help them to lead us in the way that you would have us to go. Likewise, Father, we pray for the deacons and others who take part in the worship and the work here. Pray that you would bless them and help them to continue to develop their skills as they serve thee. Father, we come to thee realizing we have many that are sick, and we pray especially tonight for Brother Cecil Rogers, and we pray that you would be with him and others that we may have in the community and of our congregation here who are sick. We pray, Father, that it be your will that you lay your healing hands upon them. Likewise, Father, we pray for those who are continuing to grieve the loss of loved ones recently. We pray that you would comfort them as only you can. Father, we pray for our country, the country in which we live, for our rulers. Pray that you would bless them, and that they would realize that they need to look to thee for guidance in making decisions. And likewise, Father, we pray that prayer for all the leaders of the world, that peace may reign and be served, that those under their power will be able to serve thee with the same freedoms that we have. We thank you for those freedoms we enjoy in this country. Father, we pray especially this time for our soldiers who are in other lands, especially those who are in very dangerous lands at this time. We pray, Father, that you would bless them, be with them, keep them safe, be with their will, and be with their families. Father, we pray that you would be with us tonight as we enter into this worship, that you would help us to tone out the things of this world, the cares of the world, that we may focus intently on thy word. Help us to take it in and to realize when we can apply it in our everyday lives, that we may be better Christians in the future than we have been in the past. Father, we come to thee asking for forgiveness of our sins, for we realize that we are human, we do sin, we're not perfect, we fall short of thy glory. We pray, Father, that you will forgive us and help us to repent of those things that we do. Father, we ask thee to continue to be with us throughout the remainder of this night and throughout future walks of life. Forgive us of our sins.
He is my everything, he is my all. He is my everything, both great and small. He gave his life for me, made everything new. He is my everything, now how about you? Some folks may ask me, some folks may say,
I want you to know how wonderful it has been to be with each and every one of you. I've just enjoyed the meeting so very much, and I have been well fed from the bottom of my stomach. I thank you. It has been so good. Some of the finest cooks in the world are right here in Limestone County, and I've known that for quite a while, and maybe that has a whole lot to do with why I'm coming back to this area, but we have enjoyed being with you, and we want you to know that anytime you can, come out and visit with us. We'd love to have you. It's good to see Jeff and Leah Mathis here tonight. We worshiped with them for the better part of 7 years in Fayetteville, and they have just meant so much to us. their children and our children were just so tiny when we first met one another. They still worship there in Fayetteville, and we're thankful they're here tonight. Good to see the Clems tonight from Sardis Springs, as well as all of you who have come to enjoy the things that we share together in Christ. Again, I want to thank the elders for the opportunity to come, and I hope you feel as though it has been profitable the time we have spent together. If you would, take your Bibles tonight and turn to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. I remember one night in the state of Alabama when a man came to his hour, the hour in which he would die. And I still remember that as the minute hand approached midnight, even I had a nervous stomach as I realized what was soon to happen. What do you think about when your hour comes? They say that at Kilby Correctional Facility, that the inmates there tremble when the lights flicker at midnight because it means that all the electricity that Kilby could muster has entered an inmate who sat on the same row that they are on. What do you do when your hour comes? I can tell you what one man did. Killing, cursing, and fighting with 5 death row guards, ski mask killer Daniel Morris Thomas was executed in Florida's Electric Chair Tuesday for murdering a man and raping his wife as her husband lay dying. Cursing and screaming, "Get off me, get off me." Thomas, 37, was subdued after a 7-minute struggle during which he kicked one guard and tried to bite another. It was violent. It was the first time this had happened in my experience. I've never even heard of it before, said spokesman Vernon Bradford. Guards assisted by a doctor and a physician's assistant managed to stop Thomas's outburst and pin him to the 3-legged oak electric chair. Prison Superintendent Richard Duggar leaned over and spoke directly into his face, apparently telling him that he would not be able to read his last statement unless he settled down. Panting wildly for about 20 seconds, Thomas quieted and began reading from a yellow legal sheet in a low voice, much of it incomprehensible to 19 witnesses, stunned by the struggle they had just observed through large windows. "We are human tools, political pawns, political human sacrifices for the politicians," Thomas mumbled, referring to Florida's 241 death row inmates. What do you do when your hour comes? Would a man at this hour have a right to think only of himself? And for that matter, would you? But what if that hour is going to involve torture, and in actuality it's going to take several hours to die? What if your hour involves a cross, the meanest, most vicious form of torture mastered down to an art by the Romans? Even the Bible itself suggests that it was something horrible in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8 when it says that Jesus suffered the death of even the cross. Even the cross. There's the picture of just how horrible it would be. What if it's even the cross? Would you have a right to think only of yourself? And for that matter, would you? It's the night of the Passover. It's the Last Supper that Jesus is going to eat with 12 men that he loves with all of his heart. It's the night that Judas is going to get up and sell his master for 30 pieces of silver. It's the same night that a mob of soldiers are going to come with swords and clubs and they're going to arrest him in the garden. It's the night that Jesus stares at the lamb, realizing that the next lamb to be slaughtered is himself. It's the night that 13 men sit around a table, 12 lords, and 1 servant. We read now from John 13 and verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, did what? Rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Jesus did what? Knowing that his hour was upon him, he did what? Knowing that the torture stake looms on the horizon, he did what? He took a towel and grabbed some water and begins to wash people's feet. Why in the world is he doing it? You know, if we didn't read any further, we would not know why he's doing such a thing as this. But I can tell you this, if a man will spend his final moments doing something like this, we had better pay attention, because you can rest assured it is mighty, mighty, mighty important. You don't waste moments when it's among the final moments. And so tonight we talk about the God of the towel. And I want to suggest to you that what's going on here in John chapter 13 is that Jesus had to change their idea of greatness. Do you realize that earlier this night, as they came into this room, do you know what the disciples were doing? The disciples on this night were fussing and feuding over which one of them was the greatest in the kingdom. And you see that when you come to Luke the 22nd chapter, in a parallel account of it. In Luke 22 and verse 24, it says there was rivalry among them. There was rivalry among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. Can you imagine Jesus having to listen to his students on this occasion? 3 years ago, he had told them that the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. He told them that at the outset of his ministry. And for 3 years, they have seen him talk to people that nobody else would talk to. They have seen him touch people that no one else would dare touch. And they have seen him serve people that no one else would serve. And on top of that, he's about to give the ultimate act of sacrifice and service for the sins of the world. He's about to give it all. And here they are, fussing and feuding over which one of them is the greatest. I tell you what, I'm amazed. I'm amazed that he just didn't take up a table and just sling that thing across the room. You know, he has been known to do that. I remember on an occasion he did just that thing. I'm surprised he didn't pick up a table, throw it across the room, and say to them, "Get out of my sight, guys. I don't ever want to look at you people again. I've told you where greatness is. I've shown you where greatness is. You won't listen. Now get out of here. Isn't 3 years enough for you to catch on?" But you know, he just didn't do that. He just didn't do it. Why didn't he do that? I tell you the reason he didn't do it is because he loved these men. And even with their fumbles, even with their slowness to catch on, Jesus loved them. And in John 13 and verse 1, it says that very plainly, that before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And so in contrast to what we read just a moment ago, there will be no kicking and screaming by this man on death row. Instead, what Jesus does is he just simply tells them again what greatness is all about. In Luke, the 22nd chapter, verses 24 through 27, notice what Jesus said as they were fighting about greatness. Verse 25, "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. He said, but not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves." I love verse 27. He says, "Who is greater? He who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table?" But he says very plainly, "Yet I am among you as the one who serves." And so Jesus just tells them again. I remember once I preached this at Sardis Springs, and Brother Elton Abernathy, at the close of the worship service, said in his prayer, he said, "Lord, help us to remember that the way up is down." And that is exactly what Jesus is trying to show them. That the key to greatness, the key to going up, is by going down. "I am among you as the one who serves." And so he shows them. He tells them, first of all, and then here in John chapter 13, he's now going to show them what greatness is all about. Can you imagine the look on their faces when he gets up to grab a towel and he wraps that towel around his waist? And on this night, every one of them should have done that. There was no servant there to do it when they came in. One of them should have taken upon themselves the responsibility to clean everyone up and to wash their feet. But you can rest assured, these 12 were not going to do that on this night. Because for one of them to have done that would have been to suggest that I'm a servant and I'm not a great one. So no, they're not going to wash any feet. Jesus gets up from the table. He grabs his towel. And he is going to adjust how they see greatness if it is the last thing he does. And ironically, it is among the last things that he does. In John 13 and verse 6, coming back there again now, it says in verse 6 that he came to Simon Peter. And Peter said to him, and I want to say it like it may have been said, Lord, are you washing my feet? And I want you to understand, Peter has a noble thought here. I'm not going to let you do it, Lord. Not you, not the Lord, not the Master. You're not going to wash my feet. He cannot fathom the idea of a Lord who would even dare to do anything. Not the Lord, not God. But this is just as much God as when he stood on that boat and said to that violent sea, Peace, be still. This is God, bowing down to the feet of these men to wash their feet. Well, you know, verse 7 sounds almost like a parent talking to a child. Jesus said, Now, Peter, what I'm doing you don't understand now, but you'll know about it after this. Yeah, you tell your children all the time, now I know you don't know, I know you don't understand, but one day you will. And that's kind of what he tells Peter here. And Peter says to him in verse 8, You shall never wash my feet. I will not let you do it. And Jesus says, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. I tell you what, he understood that. He might not have understood what all this was about him washing feet, but he understood what it meant not to have any part of Jesus. And when he heard that if I don't let Jesus do this, I can't be on his team, he plainly says to Jesus, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Just bathe me from top to bottom, if that's what it means. Get the whole thing. What's wrong with Peter? Peter doesn't understand that the great ones always serve. You ever notice in our world that oftentimes the higher a man goes up the ladder, the less he serves? Jesus would teach that the higher you go up the ladder, the more you serve. The greater you become, the more you serve. And if you cannot accept a Lord who serves, you can't be on his team, because Jesus' team serves. And then in verse 9 or verse 10, Jesus said, He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you. He had to change their idea of greatness. But furthermore, he had to teach them to serve. In verse 12 now, it says, When he had washed their feet and taken his garments and sat down again, he said to them, Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, happy are you if you do them. The light of this world was about to leave. He knew it. The light of the world was about to leave, and it was time for them to quit whining and start shining. And I want to tell you, there is no greater way in the world for us to shine for God than when we serve. Shortly after World War II came to a close, and by the way, I believe it was one of the gentlemen at Sardis Springs also, who after he heard me read this story, he said, That is exactly right. He said, I saw it. He said, I saw the very thing that you're describing here about these orphans. He said, in these places, that I remember being in Germany and places like that, and these orphans begging for food. I remember them begging for ice cream as we would come out of ice cream shops. And he said, I remember one soldier taking the ice cream as these orphans were begging, and he just threw the ice cream against the fence, and it just spattered all over the fence. And he said, I still can remember those orphan children licking the fence. Shortly after World War II came to a close, Europe began picking up the pieces. Much of the old country had been ravaged by war and was in ruins, and perhaps the saddest sight of all was that of little orphan children starving in the streets of those war-torn cities. Early one chilly morning, an American soldier was making his way back to the barracks in London, and as he turned the corner in the Jeep, he spotted a little lad with his nose pressed to the window of a pastry shop. Inside, the cook was kneading dough for a fresh batch of doughnuts. The hungry boy stared in silence, watching every move. The soldier pulled his jeep to the curb, stopped and got out, and walked quietly over to where the little fellow was standing. And through the steamed-up window, he could see the mouth-watering morsels as they were being pulled from the oven piping hot. The boy salivated and released a slight groan as he watched the cook place them onto the glass-enclosed counter ever so carefully. The soldier's heart went out to the nameless orphan as he stood beside him, and he said, "Son, would you like some of those?" And the boy was startled, and he said, "Oh, yes, mister, I sure would." And the American stepped inside and bought a dozen and put them in a bag and walked back to where the lad was standing in the foggy cold of the London morning. He smiled, and he held out the bag, and he said simply, "Here you are." And as he turned to walk away, he felt a little tug on his coat. He turned around and looked, and the boy said, "Mister, are you God?" Which reminds us that we are never more like God than when we give. God so loved the world that He gave. And that is what Jesus is trying to teach them on this occasion, that we have got to learn to serve. In Matthew the 5th chapter, in verse 16, this is the way our lights shine. He says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works." That they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's what that boy was doing. He had seen the good work, and he says, "Mister, are you God?" When we do good works, it brings glory to God. And that is exactly what Jesus is trying to help us to see, that people can see God through us if we will just learn to imitate the Master. I want to give some applications now, and the lesson will be yours. And here's the first one, and that is that we've just got to see that greatness comes through serving. Greatness is not necessarily in the limelight. Let me ask you, who are the great ones among you? Somebody might say, "Well, it's one of our elders, Brother so-and-so." Well, that might be so. He might be one of the great ones. Or, it's Robert. He gets up and preaches. He's one of, well, it might be. But do you realize that it might not be? That greatness has nothing to do with being in the limelight. Has nothing to do with being an elder or a deacon or a teacher or a song leader. And I want to tell you this, if you're in it for the limelight, then you are absolutely on the wrong team. You're not on the Lord's team. The greatest one in this congregation tonight might be someone who serves, and you and I never even see it. I like this piece. "You know, Lord, how I serve you with great emotional fervor in the limelight. You know how I eagerly speak for you at a women's class. You know how I effervesce when I promote a gospel meeting. You know my general enthusiasm at a Bible study. But I wonder how I would react. I wonder if you pointed me to a basin of water and you asked me to wash the calloused feet of a bent and wrinkled old woman, day after day, month after month, in a room where nobody saw and nobody knew." In Fayetteville, where I used to preach, there was a lady who has left us now. I preached her funeral about a year ago, I suppose now. And she was just the sweetest lady in the world. You'd go places and find out that she had sent some flowers, or somebody might say, "Look at this card that Sister so-and-so sent me," or "Guess who just called me," or "Guess who just came by for a visit." And in every case, it was Louise Skidmore. I remember I used to call her and say, "Sister Skidmore, we had somebody that visited a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't get their address. Have you got that?" And she'd always have it. She'd step back to her little desk that she had back there in her room, and she had a notebook there, and she had all that down. But sometime before I left Fayetteville, Sister Skidmore had a stroke. And it affected her through all her left side of her body, and it began to look as though to us that she would possibly never walk again. And we all loved her so much, but then one day, much to our surprise, I was standing in the auditorium and I was teaching the Bible class, And we have a little door kind of like you do over here that people could make their way in. But I was teaching Bible class, and before Bible class ended, this door opened, and all of a sudden there was a figure that moved through the door on a walker, and it was Louise Skidmore. And I looked out in the audience, and tears were just welling up in the eyes of people. You would have thought that the Queen of England had entered the room. Why the reaction like that through the whole congregation? I want to tell you, they were in the presence of greatness, and they knew it. And yet so much of what she did were in places where no one saw and no one knew. And we're going to have to humble ourselves enough to be that person. In Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verses 5 through 11, the Bible simply says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, he did not consider it robbery to be equal with God." He didn't try to hold on to all the things he had in heaven, but rather he made himself of no reputation. He was despised and rejected by men, treated as though he were the scum of the earth. He took the form of a servant. And he came in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. And Eldon Abernathy was exactly right. What did God do for Jesus? Because Jesus went down, the next verse says, Jesus was highly exalted by God and given the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those in heaven and those on the earth, of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Indeed, he's right. The way up is down. And that is what Jesus is trying to teach us. Our Master rules because he served, and he serves while he rules. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to see, secondly, our opportunities to serve. I'm afraid we live in a world that is just so caught up in selfishness. It's like everybody's got this big mountain heaped up around themselves, and it's I, me, mine, myself. Everything's about that. You know, in Luke chapter 12, you can see a man who had that very problem. I want you just to listen to this. It's kind of sickening when you read it. But anyway, Luke chapter 12 and verse 16, it says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully, and he thought within himself," now listen to this, "What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I'll say to my soul," by the way, that's the only one he got right. My soul, that really was his. "So you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." And God said to him, "You fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and then whose will these things be which you have provided? And so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Jeff Harwell used to say he had a bad case of eye strain. He did. That's all the man could think about. I, me, mine, myself. And that's the way the world is. It's me first, it's others second, and it's God last. But Jesus would say to us, it shall not be so among you. Heaven's people put God first, others second, and themselves last. And what we need to do, my good friends, is we need to ask God to just give us the eyes to see all the people in the world who need to be touched by the Lord through our hands. And I want you to understand something, that they are everywhere. You say, where are they? I want to go through a list. There is a person in your nursing home here, I'm sure, whose family never comes. And they sit day after day after day just waiting for a friend. When I was in Fayetteville, I remember one time walking into the foyer of the nursing home, and I walked in and this lady said immediately, "There's my cousin. There's my cousin." I wasn't her cousin. But I went on over there and just acted like I was, and she thought I was. I said, "Well, hey, it's so good to see you." And I just sat there and talked with her for a while. And we just had the best time. And the way I just looked at that, if she needs a cousin, then I'll be glad to be her cousin. Sometime along that time, I I went to the nursing home and I just asked them, I said, is there anybody here who doesn't receive a lot of visits maybe? And they said, well, there is one man. They said his name is Roy Webb. And I think he'd really appreciate some visits. And I said, well, I'd just like to kind of adopt him if that's okay. And they said, well, that'd be fine. I think he'd love that. We'll take you on down. So I went on down to his room and I went in there and I got in there and there was this old black man. And he had kind of dark glasses on, and I realized after a moment that Roy was blind. And I said, Mr. Roy, I said, I know you don't know me. I said, but my name is Jeff May, and they told me that you would enjoy some visiting from me. Would it be all right with you if I just start visiting with you some on a regular basis? He said, oh, that'd be just fine. And so Roy and I began to visit with one another. And I'd take Roy on walks. We'd get out there in that hallway. He was just a country boy like I was. And Roy, he kind of walked like this. And just kind of pick at him and tease him. I got to where I called him the road runner. And we'd walk down that hallway, and we'd just pretend like it was a country road that we were walking on. And I'd be holding him by the arm because he couldn't see. And so we'd be walking along, and I'd say, all right, Roy, we're coming up on Cousin Mamie's house. And Mamie was a black lady, lived two or three rooms down. We said 2 or 3 houses down. I'd say, all right, Roy, we're coming up on Cousin Mamie. Say hey to Cousin Mamie. He'd say, hey, Cousin Mamie. She'd say, hey, Roy. And we just keep on walking down the hallway, and we were headed down to James's house. And we'd get down to James's house, and he and James would talk about fishing and rabbit hunting and things like that. And they'd do the same thing almost every time, talk about fishing and hunting. And finally, Roy would say, well, James, I guess I better go. He said, now you cover your eyes now. Don't let no smoke blow in your face. He's talking about how he used to walk fast. Well, anyway, we do that day after day after day. One day I asked Roy if there was anything he particularly liked, and he said, yeah, I like Vienna sausage. I said, well, count it yours, man. I'll bring you some next time. So the next time I came, I brought about 5 cans of Vienna sausage, and he had a little drawer there next to where he'd sit all the time, and I just lined them up right there at the front of the drawer, and all he had to do was just reach over and pull out the drawer and get him a can of Vienna sausage. And when I'd go, if he was down a few cans, I'd restock it so he wouldn't run out or anything like that. And one day I went in there, and he wanted to know if he could have some more Vienna sausage. And I said, well, Roy, you've got 1 can here. He said, oh, I can't eat that. I said, why not? He said, that's my holdout can. He never would eat his holdout can. Roy got real sick. I went to the hospital to see him. And I said, Roy, there's something I want to ask you about. I said, Roy, have you ever been baptized for the remission of your sins? He said, well, I had never been to the water. And what he meant by that was that he had been sprinkled, but he never had been immersed. And I said, Roy, now we need to talk about that sometime. You get well now, we're going to talk about that. Shortly after that, he went back to the nursing home, and I went one day to the nursing home, and the nurses stopped me as I walked in the door. And they said, Jeff, Mr. Roy is gone. And I just had the worst feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I was so sad. And I went back to his room and just sat there in his room for a while. And I just couldn't help but look, but I opened the drawer, and there was 1 can of Vienna sausages in his drawer. And I sure did hate that we never had our conversation that we so desperately needed to have. But I am at least hopeful that for a while on this earth that there was a man who felt the love of a friend. And maybe somehow some of those lonesome days were made just a little bit better. And I never will forget when I got a phone call from a son that lived out in California. He was not negligent. He was just away and couldn't do much. But he said, Jeff, I know you don't know me. He said, but I'm Roy Webb's son. He said, we sure would be honored if you'd preach at my daddy's funeral. And I still remember standing up in front of an all-black church out in the country, trying to speak some words that would honor my friend. On top of all that, there's an obituary column in your paper that has the names of those who are grieving who could even be encouraged by a note that comes from a stranger. There's a garbage collector whose body could be warmed by a cup of hot coffee or tea. There's a widow who still struggles with the loss of her man. There's a couple with kids who sure could use a night to themselves and sure would smile at an offer to babysit the kids. There's an elder or a deacon or a song leader or a teacher who sometimes wonders if anyone appreciates their efforts, what a card would do. There's a child whose favorite thing is just 30 minutes of your time. There's a weak brother who could use an evening on the lake to relax and just take a load off his mind. There's a shut-in who could use a warm meal. There's a neighbor who could be touched with a care package. There's a lady who is sick who would be encouraged by a get well card. And there's a family struggling financially who could be helped by a little money. I still remember once being at a place and I saw one brother shake another brother's hand. And when he pulled his hand away, the brother that he had shaken hands with realized that something was kind of awkward about that. When he pulled his hand away, he looked in his hand, and there was a sizable dollar bill in his hand as he was just extending help to a brother. And then there's the man who cursed you yesterday, who needs you to take him a hot breakfast and teach him about the love of God. And at that point, you may be wanting to say, preacher, now you're going way too far now. Not my enemy, not the one who cursed me, not the man who despises me, not the man who hates me. Never. Do you realize who was in this room this night? Do you know who all is in the room the night of the Passover? One of those men in that room was Judas. And Jesus washed his feet just like all the rest of them, and he would take his clean feet to do the nastiest deed that has ever been done in the history of mankind. And yet Jesus washed his feet just like all the rest because he loved him, and even at that late moment was appealing to him to see the friendship so that he might not betray his master, even his enemies. Do you think all this is trivial that I've talked about tonight? It ain't trivial. In Matthew the 10th chapter and verse 42, Jesus said, "Whoever gives one of these little ones only a cup of cold water, in the name of a disciple, assuredly I say to you, he shall by no means lose his reward." You know, just a cup of cold water. You ever noticed at a funeral how long that family has to stand in line and greet people? Do you imagine their mouth ever gets a little dry? You might could just stop by and just get a cup of cold water and just walk up there to the line and say, "Here, I thought this might help you some." I tell you what, that right there means a lot to some folks. Just a cup of cold water. Jesus said, you will by no means, when you do something like that, you will by no means lose your reward. And you can rest assured your reward will be a whole lot more than a cup of water. And you must seek only God's reward. Little Chad was a shy, quiet young fella. I love this story. One day he came home and told his mother that he'd like to make a Valentine for everyone in the class. Her heart sank. She thought, I wish he wouldn't do that, because she had watched the children when they walked home from school. Her Chad was always behind them. They laughed and hung on to each other and they talked to each other, but Chad was never included. Nevertheless, she decided she'd go along with her son, and so she purchased the paper and the glue and the crayons, and for 3 whole weeks, night after night, Chad painstakingly made 35 Valentines. Valentine's Day dawned, and Chad was beside himself with excitement. He carefully stacked them up, put them in a bag, bolted out the door, and his mom decided to bake him his favorite cookies and serve them up warm and nice with a cool glass of milk when he came home from school. She just knew that he would be disappointed. Maybe that would ease the pain a little. It hurt her to think that he wouldn't get many Valentines, maybe even none at all. That afternoon, she had the cookies and the milk on the table, and when she heard the children outside, she looked out the window, and sure enough, here they came, laughing and having the best time. And as always, there was Chad in the rear. He walked a little faster than usual, and she fully expected him to burst into tears as soon as he got inside. His arms were empty, she noticed, and when the door opened, she choked back the tears, and she said, "Mommy has some warm cookies and milk for you." But he hardly heard her words. He just marched right on by, his face aglow, and all he could say was, Not a one. Not a one. And then he added, I didn't forget a single one. Not a single one. And we are reminded in that it's not a song until it's sung. It's not a bell until it's rung. And it's not love until it's given away. We must serve seeking only God's reward, no matter if anyone else ever does anything for us at all. In Matthew 6, 1 through 4, Jesus said, Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. When you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be seen by men and have glory from men. Assuredly I say to you, they have their reward. If they want to be praised by men, they'll get that, and that's all they'll get. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I have often said that's almost like when you do something with your right hand, your left hand says, boy, that was really nice. I know it. I'm really proud of you. Thank you. You know, in other words, don't pay too much attention to what you're doing for people. Don't just go home and just, oh, aren't I wonderful? Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Just do it. Don't think about it. Do it because you love the Lord, and don't seek any praise from anyone except one day from God. Seek only God's reward. Don't serve Pharisee style. And then I'll say this, and the lesson's yours. You get ready for a happy life. Do you remember there in John 13 what Jesus said? Jesus said, happy are you if you do them. Happy are you if you do them. Jesus said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Have you ever found that? Have you ever noticed that when you go and you really do something wonderful for someone else, it really gives you more joy than it could ever give them? And you are so happy with a deep kind of happiness. It is more blessed to give, as the Lord said in Acts 20:35, it is more blessed to give than to receive. I just want to tell you, folks, I think sometimes we make we make Christianity a little harder than it has to be. And maybe we really should spell Christianity Service. We spend so much time trying to persuade people that we are the Church of Christ. And we'll point to how we don't do this and don't do that, and we do this and we do that. And I'm not saying it is right to do that, to point out all the acts of worship and how that's wonderful, and we need to do that. But do you realize what Jesus said? Jesus said in John the 13th chapter, in verse 34, He said, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. And by this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Jesus says the telltale sign that will cause people to say, those people are the Lord's people, is when they see how you love one another. And I can tell you, you can point to all the acts of worship that you want to, and you can point to all we don't do and all we do. You can do that all you want to. If they see people who don't love each other and mistreat each other and aren't ever doing anything for anybody else, they are not convinced that we are the Lord's people. Because the Lord's people are servants at heart. Do you realize you're going to always be a servant? Do you realize what we're going to do forever before the throne of God? And they shall serve Him day and night forever. Heavens for servants. I like to say this in conclusion. The mark of a Christian is not someone who wears a cross around his neck. I think it's more so a person who has a towel around his waist. That's the mark of a Christian. The God of the towel. The lesson is yours tonight. If you're here and you've never become a Christian, we want to encourage you to come tonight. Just before Jesus ascended into those clouds, He told His disciples, go ye into all the world and preach this good news to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned. And so they went and they preached that message. And on the day of Pentecost, there were 3,000 souls who obeyed the gospel. Those who gladly received His word were baptized. Sometimes in a Bible class, I'll ask the question, how many people were baptized on the day of Pentecost? And most people will say, 3,000. I say, look at it again. How many people were baptized? The text says, those who gladly received His word. Every person who gladly received His word was baptized. Would you gladly receive it tonight? Would you come forward to be a Christian? Or if you need to make your life right in any way tonight, we're going to sing now to encourage you. Come while we stand and as we sing.
Almost forsaken. Let me just say, first of all, that we certainly appreciate your presence. We do have, as mentioned earlier, a number of visitors, and we appreciate your coming and being with us. And I want to encourage you to come and visit with us whenever you can. I do not have them with me, but on the table I know there's announcements out there for at least 2 other gospel meetings in this area that I believe start this next week. So you may want to look at those and want to mention those. Remember those that are sick. Let's continue to remember those that have lost their loved ones, and let's do what we can for them. Want to also say how much I appreciate the lessons that we've had. The 6 lessons that Jeff has presented have all been excellent lessons, and lessons that we need and lessons that I need. And I believe every one of them have been lessons that can help us to be more like the Lord and serve Him better. I certainly want to thank Jeff for coming. It's been a real pleasure to be able to be with him, get to know him a little better, and to be able to get to know his wife Susan a little better, and his daughter Bethany and his son Henderson, and look forward to them moving to this area. Also, I want to say thank you to so many of our ladies here who, like Louis Skidmore, he described in his lesson tonight, are always there when something happens, and it really is appreciated. And I know that there's several of you here who are women that don't ever get any recognition, but I know that every time I go to visit somebody or talk to them, you've been there already, and that means a lot. And I appreciate it, and I know that the Lord does, and we thank you for doing that. I want to say thank you also to those that have had Diane and me in your home to eat. I try not to eat as much as Jeff, but he thought that was funny. One night I didn't eat as much as him. But I do appreciate it. It's been excellent, and it's been really good. If you would, turn to sing your songbook number 893. sing number 893, and then Donnie Robinson will lead us in our closing prayer. We are one in the bond of love. We are one in the bond of love. We have joined our spirit with the Spirit of God. We are one in the bond of love. Let us sing now, everyone. Let us fill this lovely God. Let us join our hands and the world will know we are one in the bond of love.
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for all the many blessings of life. We thank the Lord that we are able to gather here during this week, hear these wonderful lessons. We pray, Lord,